As you know, this part of the program deals with the legacy of Georgina and Ulli Beier in Nigeria and Papua New Guinea, and I think rather extraordinarily we have the three of us. Chika, who doesn't need any introduction since you've just heard his wonderful paper, is of course from Nigeria. Katharina Greven is a doctoral candidate and has been a researcher and administrator at the Oceania Center in Bayreuth in Germany. And I'm originally from Sydney. We happen to, our backgrounds happen to reflect the three main sort of bases of Ulli and Georgina Beier. Ulli was born in 1922 and died in 2011. Georgina was born in 1936 and is still very much alive. Ulli was based in Nigeria from the 50s onwards, and went on there to establish Black Orpheus. Was that in 1957? And that became an enormously important literary journal for people like Soyinka and Achebe, who, as I'm sure is well known to you, are really the great figures of that period of modern African literature. They also established the Mbari, what was initially the Writers' Club and then became the Artists and Writers' Club, and something I only quite discovered the other day was that by the time they left Nigeria in 1967, they had mounted 75 exhibitions there that included Ibrahim El-Salahi's first exhibition outside the Sudan, exhibitions of many other artists who became significant in various ways. They went on to Papua New Guinea, and in some senses, there they did the same kinds of things. They actively stimulated a new culture, a new art, new milieu of appropriate to the moment of decolonization, and that included launching journals as well as encouraging individual writers and artists, and we're going to touch on those issues in just a minute. I just thought I'd mention one point by way of starting. I was fortunate to be able to spend the morning with Georgina in Sydney on my way through here, and she gave me a poster which I meant to bring along for the first exhibition of contemporary New Guinea art that took place outside New Guinea itself. It was at the Otis Art Institute, which I think was a university gallery, a small gallery in California. And I asked, how did you come to organize that? It took place in 1969, and she just shrugged and said, friend of a friend. And I think that, in a sense, reflects the way a lot of things happened in this moment. We're used now to working with foundations and art agencies and institutions and cultural diplomacy. I think that moment was much more about sort of low-key private sponsorship on the part of progressive individuals. Things happened much more informally. But I thought perhaps we were just going to start by talking about when and how we first encountered the Beiers, and maybe Chika, you.
Well, I think there are two moments in my own case. The first was my first encounter with them and their work from a distance. In other words, by reputation. Growing up and studying in Nigeria, you couldn't, especially in the humanities, you couldn't possibly avoid the work of the Beiers in literature, theater, music, visual arts, and what have you. And so the names, their names were out there. They had a very strong imprint on artistic and cultural production in Nigeria during the 50s and 60s. So growing up and studying at the University of Nigeria and Nsukka, they were like mythic figures. So that was my first encounter with their work. In the late 90s, when I came to the United States, moving from studio art to art history, I became interested in this question of the emergence of modern art production in Nigeria, but especially in the 1950s and 60s. And so I came head on to deal with the work of the Beiers. And luckily, at least for me, I was studying at the Emory University in Atlanta, and in 2000, is it 1999? Yes. I met Ulli Beier for the first time there at the university. And, we had a conversation. He was, his usual self, wasn't paying attention to, characters like me and stuff. So, but once I started talking about what I was interested in, he was like, who are you? So we started talking from that moment. And the next thing he said was, why don't you find money and come to Sydney? And so this was my opportunity that very few people had to be asked by Ulli Beier to come for a talk, to come and encounter them in their private environment. So I, quickly found the money to go to Sydney in 2000, and then I kept returning after that until he died. And so it was this research on modernism that brought me to him and Georgina more directly. And then from then, I became interested in Georgina's own work as an artist, beyond the question of her relationship with the artists that she worked with in Nigeria, but the evolution of her own work, which hopefully we can talk about a little bit later. But that was my encounter, or the circumstances of my encounter with the Beiers.
Well, my encounter was much later, so I actually got to know the Evaleva House after Ulli Beier passed away, which was in 2011. And I particularly came to Bayreuth, which is a very small city in south of Germany with a complicated history and long relationship with Hitler, actually, which they never really worked on. So there you find the Evaleva House, the Africa Center of the University of Bayreuth, and that was quite interesting and intriguing, and that's how I came to know the collection of Ulli and Georgina Beier. And then luckily, in 2012, we had a cooperation, or we still have a cooperation with the Center of Black Heritage and Cultural Understanding, and we brought the estate, or his entire archive of photos and documents, to the Evaleva House. And because I packed it with Georgina, I kind of got a bit possessive, and it was new material, nobody worked, not new, I know Chika also had a look at it, but so I wanted to work closer with it. And I also saw how Georgina decided what goes into an officially researchable archive and which is going to be destroyed or which is going to be kept private. So I found this way of private, of her own narration writing, so to say, quite interesting and intriguing. And also how they actually started to collect, which was in both countries, Nigeria and Papua New Guinea, within the mental hospitals. So there was also one point which I found quite interesting. So that was my start off.
Thanks. I first met Georgina quite briefly in 1994 when Kauage, who is really the most prominent and significant of the Papua New Guinea artists she had an association with, had an exhibition in London. But I really had a more sustained engagement with her when following 2008, one of Cambridge's most distinguished anthropologists, Marilyn Strathern, made a gift of a substantial body of work to the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. And Marilyn had begun field work in the Papua New Guinea highlands in the mid-60s, but was living in Port Moresby in the what was still then the colonial capital, but somewhere, in a sense, on a trajectory towards decolonization, with a new university, an Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies, a milieu in which people were aware that they were training the people who would lead the independent nation. Marilyn was part of that milieu at the time Ulli and Georgina arrived, and she knew them well and interacted with them in various ways. And when we received this gift of some 30 works, original works on paper, prints by Arcus Kauage and various others, and some metal sculptural pieces, which were something that tended to crop up in this kind of encounter, we also received some archival material and various letters from Georgina, and also just a set of rather scrappy notes of Marilyn's. And I realized that, as well as being a sort of leading figure in social anthropology, she'd been a sort of part-time agent and dealer of for Georgina, and there were sort of lists of Arcus and Kauage works, and would say Edmund II, Jack III, and these were referring actually to people like Jack Goody and Edmund Leach, and I kind of got the impression that if you were any kind of distant colleague of Marilyn's, you would be obliged to acquire one or more of these prints being made at this time. And we went on to mount a small exhibition out of that donation, and Georgina was tremendously positive about that, and I think wanted very much to come to Cambridge and tell her part of that story, and to make sure that her understanding of that set of interactions was what was made accessible to us. And one of the small points of difficulty around that show was drafting the sort of text panel that went at the start, because I think I was trying to use this series of words like she was a mentor for, and I think every draft she found objectionable or unsuitable in some way. And that, in a sense, takes me to a question I want to ask Chika particularly, which is, what did her relationship with these various and many individuals involve in your sense? And I suppose particularly, what was it about her and Ulli that drew people who had these aspirations, or perhaps discovered that they had them when they came into contact?
I think that, to begin with, Ulli was an incredible enabler. In other words, if he had an idea, he also had an idea how to make that idea happen. And so in a place where, and at a time when ideas were floating, across the continent, you had a young generation of writers who are producing manuscripts, for instance, but weren't getting published, because who was interested in that kind of work? not the local publishers, of which there were virtually none, and not the international publishers who cared little about this material. And so Ulli Beier was that person who decided, and this was after 1956, after he attended the first Congress of Black Writers and Artists in 1956 at the Sorbonne. He just came back and said, well, there's this magazine published in Paris. I'm going to produce an Anglophone version of this magazine. And he basically, that was how Black Orpheus was born. Because he realized that Francophone writers had attained an incredible visibility internationally, and it was simply because they had a magazine that was publishing their work, whereas Anglophone writers didn't have any. And so Black Orpheus came, he found money, he found the resources to publish the very first issues. He could talk to politicians with the same ease that he interacted with artists. And so he mobilized the resources to get this magazine going in 1957. And by the time you knew it, he was publishing the very first works of the writers that would become international superstars, Nobel laureates, and what have you. So that was one aspect of Ulli Beier that was magnetic. He knew how to make things work, especially for young artists looking for avenues to make their work visible. And it was the same thing that happened in terms of the visual arts, right? But of course, one has to remember that earlier on, he was working with Suzanne Wenger.
Yes.
Until right from the moment they came to Nigeria in 1950. They were working in partnership across most of their projects, until in the early 60s when, Georgina came on the scene. And so you had these two individuals, initially Ulli and Susan, who were so enthusiastic about the incredible exuberance, literary, artistic exuberance that they witnessed in Nigeria at the time. And so they wanted to make sure that they established the infrastructure to enable and sustain this work. And that's what then led to the Mbari Artists and Writers Club, right? And so often in reaction to the colonial status quo, and this is really what one has to understand, that from the very beginning, Ulli was, irredeemably anti-colonial. And so much of the projects that he was involved in were in reaction against the official status quo. When Wole Soyinka's play for the independence celebration was denied because it seemed to be critical of the colonial system and so forth, he said, well, I'm going to make sure you produce this play. Right, and so he was that kind of person, and that's what attracted, young artists, writers to them and their work. I would think this ability to mobilize resources to make things happen in places where, as you mentioned, there were no big foundations and so forth. When, for instance, and this will be the last point, when, for instance, he realized that there was a foundation out there that had a pot of money to give to writers and artists across the colonial world, he got the money to make work happen. It turned out later on, and this he told me so many times, he wasn't aware of this, but this pot of money was provided by the CIA to fund radical work across Africa and elsewhere through the Farfield Foundation. It wasn't until the late 60s that everyone knew, oh, wow, it was the CIA that was funding these radical work, anti-colonial work. But it turned out, frankly, that they wanted these young radicals to be busy with their work so they don't look to the Soviets. And that was really the point. So for them, it didn't matter where this resource was coming from, but they were able to make the kind of work that they needed to make at that point in time.
And what do you think was involved specifically in Georgina's interactions with these artists? I mean, was she a teacher? Was she providing them with, a steer in terms of what their work should look like? Was she providing a certain concept in terms of notions of individual expression and appropriate ranges of reference? There are some artists where one might see, affinities between their work and Georgina's. There's other artists where it's absolutely different. But
that's a very important question because it's preoccupied the scholarship right from the beginning. The noted poet Christopher Okeke-Agulu, who was part of this, new intellectual elite, Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, and so forth, at that point in time, the early 60s, were so horrified. He, in particular, Christopher Okeke-Agulu, was so horrified by the work of the Oshobo artists because, they didn't go to school, they didn't go to college, and he blamed the Beiers for that, for presenting this kind of work. And then following from there in the literature was a debate about how people like Georgina Beier and Ulli Beier were producing a kind of naive art that was presented as the authentic African modernist expression. This played out in the journal African Art in the 70s, and there were very convincing, well, not to me, arguments about how, Georgina Beier was like, and Ulli Beier were the masters of the game, so they told them what to paint and what to make, and the only way you can figure that out, if you went to Papua New Guinea, you could see that the artists there were making similar kind of work. Well, for me, it's because the people who are making these comments actually hadn't looked at the work to see that there is no relationship. If you were to analyze the work that was being produced in Papua New Guinea and the work that was being produced in Nigeria. But there was this sense that, well, they are Europeans, so they must be the ones that were dictating the work that the Africans were doing. One of the things I've done in recent years is actually to look at Georgina Beier's work, who, by the way, was 21 at the time that this was unfolding, and therefore was a young artist trying to even understand her own work as an artist, unsure of her own work. So the idea that she was this, masterminder of these artists didn't make sense. What I've done in recent years is to closely look at the evolution of her work. And what I have argued and what I presented to her is that, and to the art world, is that the work actually was inspired by that of the so-called students. So that the kind of relationship that I actually see unfolding in the work runs opposite the kind of ideological arguments that have been made against, the Beiers and so forth. So it's that what at best, what you see in, say, Georgina's relationship with Jacob Afolabi, especially, who in fact was older than she was, is that her work began to change, to take on linear elements that it didn't have before she came to Oshobo. And one could see that it had something to do with a kind of dialogue between her and Jacob Afolabi. But that's not anywhere in the literature. That's not anywhere in the commentaries about the kind of relationship between her and the artist. So that's something that I'm particularly interested in seeing how that actually unfolded, which is different from when you think of Ulli Beier, who anyway was a critic rather than an artist, so couldn't prescribe to the artist what to paint and stuff, because he wasn't an artist. But he could criticize, he could like, in the way that art critics, thumb down or thumbs up the work of artists. But that's a different conversation.
And Katharina, does your work through the archive, bring a different perspective on that kind of question of what the nature of their dealings with these various people are?
Well, if you look at the archives and how it generated itself from the beginning is very much also dependent on which people they met and with which people, for example, Georgina worked with, what is in the collection now, and also looking at her work. So it's all kind of part of the archive, and which also leads to the second, let's say, peak, is actually the Ivaleva House, where the collection of their modern artworks which they collected and also what Georgina produced is still there. So you can see, especially in the house, and now because also the photographs and the documents are there, the entire, so to say, overall image which they kind of constructed and presented in that house, and which can be said it's a manifestation of their idea of Africa. But this is completely dependent also on the people which they encountered with, so similar to what Chika said.
And I know that Kawage spent time in Bayreuth with them, and what about others? They hosted other artists there and ran an exhibition program?
Well, the exhibition program was as plenty as in Nigeria, for example, and they also invited most of the artists they worked with in Nigeria and in Papua New Guinea to the Ivaleva House. So it was a way of kind of introducing the artists in residency and work closely with, you mentioned the friends before, to work with their friends again, because this what it really was about. It was also the relationship between the almost family, extended family which they worked with.
And I think it's important also to make this point, that if one looks at the spectrum of Ulli Beier's critical enterprise. In other words, the range of makers, writers, artists that he worked with. It's hard to make any argument about Ulli Beier's idea of African art or African literature, simply because he covered the entire possible range. That in the same way that he published Denis Brutus's manuscript at a time when the apartheid government banned his work, Ulli went to South Africa, smuggled this work out, and published it in Nigeria. He was working to publish the first writings of Soyinka, their first plays, and so forth, and at the same time was encouraging Amos Tutuola, who, was the poster writer, or I didn't want to say poster boy because he was an older artist at the time, of this kind of naive literature that was coming out of Africa. So at the same time that he was working with Twin 77, who didn't go to any art school and who was the signal Oshobo artist, he was working with Ibrahim El Salahi, who went to the Slate. So the range of work, or the range of imagination that is implicated in the work that he produced is so complex, is so diverse, that when arguments about how Ulli Beier, wanted to present African artists, it depends on which African artists he worked with that you're looking at any point in time. So I think that's an important...
And perhaps it's important to add, I signaled at the start that, in a sense, the three of us related to these three main countries and bases where they had been active, but as you mentioned, activity and relationships actually extended very much wider than that, and there was work in India.
Yes.
They were active in Australia in relation to Aboriginal artists who were represented in the Iwala collection, and people here who work in this part of the world may be interested to know that when the Oceania Center, Apeli Hauofa's Oceania Center, was established in Suva, and I can't remember quite what year that was, but probably back about 2005, 6, or earlier actually, Georgina was involved in workshops there and in fact designed the Oceania Center logo, so that the legacies of these projects have come, in a sense, up to the very recent present. And if we had people representing all of these places, we wouldn't fit on this stage. I think at this point we should open up to questions or comments from the audience.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you a little more about Suzanne Wenger. Because I don't remember the chronology anymore, but my understanding is that those workshops were her initiative, that Georgina didn't come along until after that was, the art part of it was well underway. And she has interested me because she was an Austrian, lived through the Nazi occupation, and then went to Paris, and was a modernist, and
Yeah.
for a certain, really, sorry, she was involved with that group of sort of, what were they called again in Vienna?
The secession.
The Winterwasser.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So she brought a whole lot of stuff with her when she came that had to do with certain religious spiritualism, a French modernism. As far as I remember, Ulli was hired to teach linguistics at the University of Wellington, and really was more focused on literature at the beginning.
Yes.
So when is the transition
Okay.
where he kind of becomes active in the visual arts, and when Georgina goes off and becomes a priestess, and Georgina enters in? What's the chronology?
Okay. So briefly, Ulli, as you rightly pointed out, was hired to teach English as a extramural program attached to the University of Ibadan. And he and Susan arrived in 1950. Susan needed, as with Ulli as well, just needed to get away from Europe after the war. He was interned in Israel, and so forth. So he needed, as happened with a generation of Europeans who were, kind of fed up with what happened to the Enlightenment project. So Nigeria was the place that they found themselves, through strange, circumstance. But they ended up in Nigeria, and right at the very beginning, were interested in art. And as Katharina pointed out in passing, the first art project that they did was with the mental home in 1951. They had a workshop for inmates there and had an exhibition, publishing a small catalog of the work. So he was already interested in the visual arts since the very beginning. But then in terms of finding the kind of critical mass with which to begin like a sustainable workshop environment happened only later, after he used the Black Office to encourage and create a network of artists. So the Black Office was publishing art before the workshop started after 1960. So there's a part of the workshop that, yes, Suzanne Wenger was involved in, and in her own spiritualist kind of aesthetics and so forth, what she called the New Sacred Art Movement, which was trying to more or less transform Yoruba religious art into this kind of pseudo-modernist, surrealist, spiritualist kind of art, which was different from the workshops that Ulli and other Nigerian artists, Okeke, Demasmoko, and so forth, began as part of the Mbari Artists and Writers Club, which was, an intellectual enterprise, with college-trained writers and artists who needed a forum to make their work. So that's a separate workshop system that started out of the Mbari, as different from the one that Suzanne Wenger was operating. Now, it was the one that came out of the Mbari that then a section of it moved to Oshobo, and it was at Oshobo that Georgina arrived in 1962 or so, or 63. And then in 64, she began to run the workshops out of her home. And it was that workshop that is often cited when you think and talk about the Oshobo artists and so forth. Although Susan Wenger's own group has been and still, is identifiable, even after she died. But so that's sort of the chronology. Georgina came in 63, began to organize the workshops in 64 through 65 and 66.
It's exactly the same time as the project was going on here in New Zealand with the workshop for training artists in Maori art.
Maybe in the water.
Hi. I guess this question is about thinking about the archive and also maybe in response to Chika's, I think, correct rereading of how African Arts, the African Arts Journal had sort of positioned the relationship of the Beiers to, how they influenced. And I know the Nigerian situation much more than I do the Papua New Guinean. So I guess the question is, if we are going to pick that apart and agree that they weren't moving around and influencing artists to do the same thing in different locations, what kind of material archive accompanied their kind of movements? I mean, I guess my question is, are they bringing materials of things that they were working on in Nigeria with them to Papua New Guinea? What are those kind of archival connective tissues, I guess, if you like, of these people? I mean, if we're thinking about these comparative modernities and we have these mentor figures that are moving around, is there any way of thinking about that spread of materials? I mean, is Black Orpheus, sort of circulating in Papua New Guinea? I don't know if that's
So I think you're both going to.
Yes. Yeah. Let me just say, in terms of the archive, right? I would like to think about the archive not as material things, but in the way that the Hampateba, the writer, the African writer, described. It says that the death of an old man or woman in Africa is like the burning of a library. In other words, human beings, are vessels of memory, history, knowledge, and all that. So in terms of what they went with themselves, right? That's the archive that they traveled with, more than, photographs or artworks and so forth. So you can see in terms of the kind of workshops, for instance, there are similar workshop environments, right? But in terms of the work that came out of that, except one has to deny these artists, any agency, right? To say that, yes, it's the enablers that determine the aesthetic material conditions of the work or the conceptual conditions of the work rather than the artists. I think it's a great disservice to the artists themselves. I mean, someone like Twin 77, you couldn't, convince Twin 77 that you were more intelligent than he was. You couldn't do that with him. So a character like that. So there are things that one has to pay attention to in terms of what was transferred and what was not transferable through and across these different locales.
Thanks, Katharina.
I agree with Chika, but I also see the archive more as an image making. So whatever they, now in terms of material, they travel very often with the modern collection, but the artifacts, for example, they left behind. They tried to open museums, which was not very successful, but also Georgina always refers to them as orphans who came to them and who had they had to give it back at one point. So you see different ways of how to handle with the material. And of course, all the documents and photos are now these image creation, which do reflect on the artifacts they left behind or the institutions.
Thanks. Terry Smith.
Oh,
Thanks.
great. This is more a question for Chika, relating to the work of Georgina Beier, who you mentioned and who you're working on. Let me ask you a real polemical question. I've seen the work. Is she an Indigenous modernist as an artist?
Well, not if I know what Indigenous modernist means.
Exactly, yeah.
I know of modernists.
Right, but for the people who don't know her work, it is very much a kind of, if I could read it briefly this way, it's very geometric in structure. I haven't seen one come up, so at least the work that I've seen like some 2 or 3 years ago. But it clearly develops motifs from various settings within Nigeria in a very intense way, and has in its own way become a hybrid form that parallels the work of so many white artists or and curators, people who work with people in these situations. And in effect, the way I read it just was as a projection of a kind of ideal art that she herself, in a way, summarised all the work that she'd been looking at, particularly the African work, more than the art from Papua New Guinea, and created, she probably would have called it a universal art out of some word like that. But it's, to me, less than that. It's more, so in a certain way, it's an Indigenous modernism produced by a non-Indigenous person, one could say.
Okay, so the reason I said I'm not quite sure what Indigenous, because I really don't use that term a lot, Indigenous modernists. I think of modernists in various locations where they work. That's the only way I think about modernism. But if one were to look at her work, and this is really the point I was making earlier, the transformation of her work as a result of her encounter with other artists in Nigeria in particular, because that was her formative years as an artist. And one cannot, I think it's not productive for me to think of it in this blanket term of white artists working in an African context, because there are various shades of these relationships, these kinds of, let's call them immersions, that are either superficial, think of it, a European artist who didn't want to know where this art comes from. They're only interested in the form, right? Or of an artist like Susan Wenger who becomes a Yoruba high priestess. How do you deal, and it wasn't that she went and, took the high priestess title for herself. The Yoruba priests made her a high priestess. So is the problem now the color of her skin, right? Or is it that there's a way of thinking about these very complex relationships that are not often reducible to whether the origin of the artist? So I think it's a larger conversation, but I think one has to think of that.
Now, I actually don't have the time, but I think we have to leave it there. Thank you all very much. But I think it's just important, finally, to add that one of the things we were concerned to do in the Multiple Modernisms network and project was make resources and archives more widely available, so that particularly people who were thinking about teaching and so on had sources to draw upon. And Katharina has been involved in sort of step-by-step getting some of this material online.
Yes.
So I'm sure if you go to the website of the Iwela House, there will be some links to what is online already, and that will be further developed in due course.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks to you all.